Taylor, the chairman of the Learning and Skills Group. Welcome to our very international audience today. We have people, probably a wider collection of people internationally than we've ever had before. And that's great because, of course, the topic we have today is classroom techniques across cultures. And we have Niall Shanahan leading it for us. There are, yes, David. David has just pointed out there are some recordings of you reading poetry. It is me reading poetry. That's on something called Classic Poetry Lab. We'll come back to that later on if we have time at the end, David. Niall Shanahan is a trainer with a great deal of experience of delivering training internationally and has some great tips to share, but also he has some challenges he faces that he would love to get your opinion on. With such an international audience, I think this is a perfect chance to really expand all of our understanding about how we do training in the classroom internationally. What I'm going to do is just move forward through some housekeeping slides and then hand over to Niall. Normally, of course, we have quite didactic webinars where people make a point and then we have a bit of interaction. This is going to be the other way around. There's going to be some question answering and some context setting from Niall. The rest of it is all going to be discussion with everybody here. So I'm delighted the text chat is moving so quickly. Let me just get rid of the window here with the dial-in, and I'm going to move through our housekeeping very quickly. First off, we're always asked, will the slides, will the chat and the recording be available later? And the answer is yes, it will. Everything is always available, certainly by the Monday. We try to get it done by the Friday after the presentation on learningandskillsgroup.com. That's www.learningandskillsgroup.com. So please feel free to visit that on Monday, and you should find everything there. It's a free community of 6,000 people, well, over 6,000 people in our field in the learning and skills profession. Please join in the other discussions and so on that you'll see on the site. On the issue of sound, we use a headset or your computer for sound. If you have any trouble dialing in, I will make that dial-in information available later on, and of course also the international phone numbers as well. We are going to use chat a lot today. In fact, we're going to use it so much that I'm going to expand the chat window and I'm going to reduce the slide space because I think it's going to be better to have these proportions when we're talking today. The hashtag, if you enjoy today's session, is #LSG Webinar. Please feel free to share your thoughts and your reflections online in Twitter. I'm just pausing there slightly. We've just hit 100 people. That's fantastic for what's going to be a very, very different type of interactive session with Niall Shanahan. And we have from Moscow, Evgenia saying good morning and good morning, and indeed, good morning. Good morning, bonjour to everybody online from different parts of the world. It's great to have such an international audience. That's enough from me and my today, Niall Shanahan of Training Synergy and International Training Consultant, talking about classroom techniques across cultures. Niall, over to you.
Thank you, Don, and good morning, everybody, from a London that's looking a bit autumnal. It's not very sunny, but the sun wants to shine, you can tell. But it's still quite warm. We've got the door open here. This isn't going to be a talk, I can assure you all. Thank you all for coming. There's over 100 of you here now. Keep the chat coming. Keep your ideas coming. It really is. This came from discussion I had with people at the Learning Performance Institute, with other colleagues, and a webinar earlier on this year. And we got some really good discussions going on, some really good ideas. So essentially what I want to do is just sort of throw out some ideas, throw out some questions really, and see what you guys can come back with, because I'm sure with this kind of international audience we're going to have some really clever ideas. So that's me. slightly more friendly picture than the other one, although it's in the wrong position. I've been working in training for years. I've been mostly training in the UK, but of the last few years, I've been doing a lot more training across the world, and I have encountered differences, and I have encountered some pretty difficult sessions where I'm thinking, what happened there? Particularly where English is a second language, or the culture and the learning culture is.
Can I just, sorry to interrupt you just for a second, Martin and Neil, I'm sorry about this.
Sure.
I've just noticed that Martine is saying that there's a terrible echo. Martin, I don't have an echo, and I'm listening on a number of different devices. Other people online don't have an echo. So, okay, guys, we've got it. There's no echo. That's fine. Thank you. So, Martine, it may be at your end there's an echo, and usually that happens if you've got more than one audio device working, perhaps a telephone and a computer. And also I need to say, Sarah has just asked, I haven't done a webinar before. Is this how I contribute? Sarah, yes, it is. Martin, thanks. If you sign out, sign in again, that'd be great. And Sarah, yes, it is. You contribute via the chat. There are too many people on the line at the moment to pass around a microphone. We have 100 people. It doesn't work. If you have a small group of 12, we can do that. But we have 10 times as many as that. Neil, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Don. Yes, so I've been doing a lot more international training, and also I've been having to organise training projects for various clients in cultures very different to our own. And there are challenges there, and one of the challenges was, as you can see on the slide there, they want accredited trainers, so they want the kind of accreditation that we have in the UK, which is like the LPI's TPMA. And my challenge was, well, how am I going to translate that to a culture where they deliver training in such a different way? So these are the areas I'd like to talk about today. Get your ideas, get your input and your feedback. So start with a question. This came up the last time we had this discussion. Does it really matter if you're running a training session and your learners don't say a thing during your training session? Does it matter? Well,
and this is the core question, isn't it, Neil? Because we have a session, we have a feeling in the UK and in our traditional ways of training, perhaps in the UK and the US and Western Europe, that people have to say something. It doesn't matter though. Lots of feedback we're coming from
Dawn
people.
says it does.
Some people saying yes, it does, and other people saying no, it doesn't. It depends on different ways of learning. Julian's answer is, it depends. Dawn's quite clear. She says, yes, it does, exclamation mark. Some people are reflecting, and Craig Taylor says, no, it doesn't matter. Okay. We've got a lot of conversation about ducks, so I think we can push the ducks to one side and focus on what Neil's talking about. That would be helpful. Okay.
Well, I'm sort of probably...
Light bulb Joe, interesting on Joe's comment, it depends on the culture, but it's important for them to engage. She says, what... Now, Sarah Montgomery says that she's trained in Tunisia, Egypt, Armenia, India, and Iraq, and never had this problem. Sarah, could you just detail, what is the problem? People not contributing? Okay, if that's the problem, then please share more about that. Okay, so Neil, what's your reflection on what the comments we've got so far are?
I agree with everybody. It does depend.
You can't agree with everybody because some people are saying it's important, some people say it's not important.
I think it is important, but I tell you, it's important to me because, hence that slide, I like asking lots of questions and I like getting the feedback from people because that makes me feel as the trainer, oh, this is going well.
Right.
However, if I don't get that, does that necessarily mean it isn't going well? And again, if you're in a culture where learners are used to sitting quietly and being told, given lots of information, if they're absorbing that, and that's okay. So this is the question really, is it more important for me, the trainer, or is it more important that I know that they are learning?
And we have some interesting reflection from Stephen. I lectured in Singapore. They'd never ask a question. Happened to me with Japanese audiences, Stephen. Same reason, potential for losing face. But also, Therese points out, in some cultures, asking the teacher a question can be construed as insulting.
There you go.
Abby says, look, it's not about how you feel, Neil. It's about how the delegates feel. Yes. All right. Now, Jane raises an interesting point as well. If you're teaching how to coach, they need to practice it, so they need to be speaking. But maybe for teaching Excel, it doesn't matter, as long as they write the function. So, Neil, how much does it rely on the subject matter? That's an interesting and important point. How much does it rely on the subject matter?
I think it will rely on the subject matter, and again, we're going to come to this later about like looking at learning objectives. So, If the subject matter is sort of very technical, perhaps maybe it isn't something, it's important about absorbing information, about taking notes and quietly listening. And but whereas if it's something to do with communication, say, well then hopefully you will be getting some communication from your learners. So yeah, I think subject matter will make a big difference.
I do take your point, though, about that we have, as trainers, I used to be a classroom trainer myself, this feeling that we ought to be doing this and we're failing if we're not doing it. I think we're getting a lot of good feedback here from people saying, some people saying it's absolutely important, but I think actually what we're coming to is a consensus that people are saying it's not so much that people necessarily speak this important, but as Chris too says, if there's no feedback, sure there's other ways, sure there's better way. Well, actually, no, Chris is saying if there's no feedback, sure they'd be better off reading a book or some other interaction. I'm not sure. I think sometimes you can be learning without even feeding back to somebody interacting with them. So we'll come back to, Dave, your question about how we assess learning later on. Is that right, Neil? We'll be looking at assessment later on?
Yeah, we
All
will
right.
do, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so carry on, Neil. What are you thinking about where we've got so far?
I think it's important, the reflection that somebody mentioned, it really isn't about me. It's not about the trainer. It's very much about the learners. So if you're confident in your material, you're confident in what you are delivering, and you have built in, assessments, as we're going to come to later on, then in a sense that interaction that you expect, desire sometimes, maybe that's why we like being in a classroom in front of a group of people. We like it. We get a buzz out of it. So if we don't get some feedback, we're thinking it's not working.
Quick side moment here on body language, because Kirsten's saying body language will tell you how much people are engaged. And this is an interesting point. The difference between feedback and engagement. You can know sometimes if a class is engaged by looking at them,
Correct,
regardless of what they're saying. So I think that's an interesting point, isn't it, Neil? Of course, Evgenia points out there is no body language online, which is why in our sessions we rely so much on the chat, just to see if people are contributing. And if you like, Neil, perhaps this environment we're in right now, online, relying on people to chat, is not really very much what you're talking about. The face-to-face environment is very different, isn't it, from that point of view?
It is very different. But you're right, somebody saying about body language. I mean, if somebody is sat there and you can tell from their very posture, by the look in their eyes, that they are alert and they are listening, well, you can't really complain, and they're absorbing whatever information there is. If they're rather glazed over, then obviously you've got a problem and you need to sort of snap them out of it. But so all these things come in. As far as online training goes, well, that throws up its other challenges as well, and I think we just have to accept the limitations of online and the absence of body language.
I should point out that we've asked the question: what are we talking about here? Neil, am I correct in saying we're talking about classroom here, face-to-face classroom environment?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Because that's where the challenges are going to be.
Yeah, I like the points people are raising with. I like the points people are raising about questions being asked out of the classroom session, and also about the need for reflection. Also, I was laughing there. Rob said he gets concerned with sleeping learners, not silent one. Rob, honestly, I had somebody fell asleep in my class in 1993. I thought that was just terrible. It was after lunch. That'll never happen to me again. Do you know what? 2 weeks ago, I was giving quite a high-profile session at quite a well-known business college in the UK. Afterwards, I got fantastic reviews for it. Guess what? I still had somebody fall asleep after lunch in my session. Sometimes there are some things you just can't beat. There we go. Anyway, it's not about me. It's about you, Neil. Carry on.
Well, I think what you're pointing to is also a good point. I had that happen to me, to a senior civil servant in Whitehall, and basically it was after lunch and there was snoring heard. But that was because I had been charged with delivering what they called training, but really was just a glorified PowerPoint presentation, and I would have fallen asleep after lunch, to be honest.
Right.
So yeah.
Okay, so somebody's asking how do you deal with it. The trick is you walk round the classroom and you walk behind the person who's asleep and you start talking very loudly, and that sorts it out without embarrassing that person too much, because they wake up and they get back into it. Okay.
Or you ask the person next to them a question, and that usually jolts
okay.
them out, so you're not drawing attention to the fact that they've nodded off, but by the fact that they hear this voice clearly, they often wake up then.
Fantastic. Okay.
Anyway, we're not talking about dealing with narcolepsy, we're talking about intercultural training, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. it doesn't really matter where you're training in the world as long as you get the right results. Is that right?
Well, I suspect that this is a question which is a loaded question, Neil. How do we know what the right results are?
Well, there you go. That's a good question. Well, because let's say when let's say you're training someone on a software application, okay, something very simple, and you're going through the training, you're doing your demonstrating, whatever you're doing, it doesn't really matter where it is in the world, and then they show that they can do what you've just demonstrated to them. They can do it, so that means they've learnt. Everybody happy? Job done. Or is it?
Is this the question you're asking the audience?
I am asking the audience, exactly. Does it really matter where you're training in the world? Am I being culturally oversensitive and worrying about people? Shouldn't I just get on, go and get the results?
So in other words, just go out and do the work, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter about interaction. Just go ahead and do the results.
Exactly.
Get the results. All right.
So we're getting asked some interesting responses here, and I think what the key there is when you're looking at exactly behavior change is the result you're looking for, well, to a certain extent, but you're wanting people to leave the training room and go on. They've got to apply this back in the workplace. So a simple demonstration of their ability to, go through certain functions in, let's say, an application isn't necessarily meaning you've got the effective training or the buy-in.
We have questions here, don't we, about motivation. Stephen's
Exactly.
saying we've got short-term retention, but are they actually going to do it long-term? Holly's raised the interesting point of cultural sensitivity being important, and I do think that is an issue. In other words, people may simply be doing in the short term what they think you want them to do, but it won't necessarily impact their long-term behaviour.
Well, that's why my the next slide says, how can we measure whether learning objectives are being met, but in a culturally sensitive way? It opens up a broader thing, back to this thing about questions and interaction. But I think we can recognise as trainers that it's not just about showing people how to, it's very much about why to, and I think we're seeing those come up in some of those the contributions from people. Why am I here? Why am I doing this? Why am I learning this? What difference is it going to make? What's in it for me?
I have to say we're getting a lot of very valuable feedback from people. I mean, Deb Herriot says, look, where possible, I like to talk for a short time, then ask the trainees to carry out the activity. To do is better. And that does strike me as being quite a good way of seeing whether people have met the objectives, if they're doing it in an environment which is not where they're going through the motions, but where they seem to be carrying something out.
Yep.
But at the same time, Rob says, check you're getting the right results. Place onus on attendees to flag when they are not. They own their objectives. That's a really interesting point. And it comes again down to the degree of individual employee autonomy in different areas of the world.
Yep.
Neil, have you got any reflections on that?
I do. It's just coming back to me. I remember training in India, and it was on a software application. It was part of a whole new process and change project. And everybody, we were talking about that interaction in the class. They were making body language was absolutely right. I would ask questions, I would pause, am I going too fast? And I was getting very affirmative body language back saying, we're with you. Then when I actually asked them to demonstrate, and this was the men in the group, I'm afraid, they couldn't do it. But they didn't want to say that they didn't understand, and I think this reminds me of your quotation, Don,
Yes.
about have I made myself understood.
Yes.
They weren't going to admit that, and then when you actually were testing them, and that was quite tricky because they got it wrong, and they would literally just sort of steamroller through and, almost lie and say, no, you do it this. Yeah.
Jessica reflects on the same thing. Chinese students, she says, won't flag when they don't know. They think it's disrespectful and wasteful of the teachers and the class time. It's up to them to sort it out for themselves later. And yes, I mean, I have this phrase which I got in Turkey when I was teaching there for 5 years, which is, you don't say, did you understand? In fact, if you say that in Turkish, it's very rude. What you say instead is, anlatabildim mı? Which is, was I able to explain? Which I think is a great way of shifting the emphasis. Nonetheless, of course, it is still the case that people will not tell you that you didn't explain it properly. So you have to set the thing up so that you are able to to see, as I think people have been saying again and again here, that people are actually doing it. But that you've said, Neil, that seeing that people do it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing it in quite the right way. So how can we make sure that we're meeting their objectives how can we make sure that learning is taking place in a culturally sensitive way?
Exactly, and it is more than just doing it, because I have left training rooms where, as far as I've been aware, everything's gone fine.
Yes.
They've demonstrated they could do it. They say they're happy. Then the feedback that comes from their managers is they're not happy, they're not confident, they're not sure about it all. And I'm thinking, but that wasn't what happened in the training room. And what I missed, I think, was like the bigger picture, which was they're not happy about this whole project. You know, they're not really bedded into this. Their hearts and minds have not yet been won. And yet, so I was sort of skimming the surface, thinking I'd done my job, and actually I probably there needed to be some interaction there, some cultural sensitivity. And this wasn't just a national cultural sensitivity. This was it was a global organisation, but it's an organisational cultural sensitivity as much as anything, to understand their feelings around the whole project rather than just their ability to navigate around a new IT environment.
A couple of things here. So Evgenia says, and I agree with her, we cannot say it is their problem. It is our problem when communication fails, and I think the onus is on us to do it right. Dave says, let's do a positive spin. What about getting each student to regularly identify a learning point that they have taken away? So let's show something positive.
Yep. So it's like recapping in quite a formal way, but actually pointing out something that you are taking away.
And I always believe in giving people permission to talk, which is why we have this silly business at the beginning about talking about the weather where we are in the world. It gives people to talk, permission to chat online here. Mm-hmm. At the beginning of the session, I would always try to give people to talk, permission to talk, by getting them to speak in a comfortable way to the person next to them. You don't have to understand what they're saying. It could be a different language. But they can be talking to the person next to them about maybe what they're hoping to do and so on. That will, in many cultures, I'm not saying in all cultures, give people a feeling that it's okay to open their mouths and speak in a classroom in a way they haven't necessarily done before. And even if they're only talking to the person next to them about how things are going, that will start breaking the ice and getting people to the state where they can share their feelings about the progress they've made. And because they're doing it in their own culture, hopefully it's in a culturally sensitive way.
Well, David's got a question now. Are all cultures happy with knowledge being checked in a public way? And that's really what stimulated my question on the slides, David. I'm not sure. What's other people's experience? Well, there you go. Yes and no, probably.
No, yeah. A lot of people saying that no. A lot of people aren't happy being put under the spotlight. I like Abby's point. We put post-it notes on tables so learners can note down things more privately.
Yep. And I remember when Craig had that idea before, when we were to discuss this, about giving people like an anonymous phone line to just sort of come to feedback to, and so you're really getting the impact.
Yeah, this was Craig Taylor last time we did this. And unfortunately, I don't think he's online at the moment, but he had this great thing he did when he was in the Middle East, and he had a phone line set up so people could call in, and he had the transcript translated so that he could see the honest feedback from people. It's a very brave thing to do, the honest feedback about what people were thinking, what they'd learned. Really good. I love that idea.
One thing I did when I was last in Brazil, and this is where language was a bit of an issue, and then we had a latecomer join the session. It was all, anyway, rather disorganized. And one thing I did, which it worked well for me, but I'd be interested to see what people think or where that would not work, is I got the people who I'd trained on day one to train the newcomer on day two.
Interesting.
In Portuguese. Now, I don't speak Portuguese, but I just made sure, one, that they were asking questions, which they did, and then I could see the demonstration of things the new learner had to do. But it did work out, and it meant everyone was engaged, and obviously recapping on their learning, and it really worked. And I could just about keep up with the Portuguese and the body language. Are there places where you think that would be impossible, you could never do that? Any cultures where people will think, no, don't even think about it, don't go there?
I love it as an idea. I would love to hear people's responses to that idea of getting the class to teach itself in small groups.
Yeah.
Again, that's sort of taking up this idea of making it positive.
Active learning.
By the way, a lot of interesting thoughts coming through, which I'm going to pick up with Neil in a second. But I'd like to just discuss Neil's question here, which I think is a great one. the idea of getting people to peer-to-peer teaching, as Melody puts it. And I've done this myself, actually. In Istanbul, I used to get people to talk, to train each other in groups, and then come back together as a group. And it felt terribly empowering for the group. People loved it.
Well, they say to teach is to learn, and I think it does. It means people are really engaged, but you could be slightly putting them on the spot, as in their ability, to do that, to facilitate that. I'm wondering where people think it wouldn't work.
I'm not. Yes, Sarah has said it has worked in India, Iraq, and Tunisia,
Right.
and Rob is saying that you could ask groups to create coaching questions, which help consolidation and application. It's a nice idea.
Uh-huh.
Anne was asking, is it just an extension of train the trainer? I'm not sure it's an extension of train the trainer, because we're not giving people training techniques. We're asking people to focus on the subject matter itself.
I give them hints and tips, as in, look, try asking them a question rather than tell them and send them to sleep. So, ask them, what do you think happens next? That's all the trainer I do, but otherwise it's, but people are on the spot. And does anyone think there's somewhere where they wouldn't do that?
No, nobody seems to be saying that that you couldn't get peer-to-peer working somewhere.
Well, that's good.
Well, sorry, I say that. Chris too jumps in with Japan. Chris, that's a single word answer. Can you explain why you think it wouldn't work in Japan?
You've been in Japan, haven't you, Don?
No, I've taught Japanese people in the UK.
Oh, that's what you did, right?
Yeah. Dawn says she's done peer-to-peer successfully in Rome and Milan, worked very well there. And I think this is a good point. It's a good way of getting more into a short time.
Yeah.
Which is a fair point. Okay, nothing more from Chris too about why it wouldn't work in Japan. But okay, maybe it wouldn't work everywhere. I used to work for a Japanese company. Formal hierarchy can inhibit interaction. Yeah, I have seen that. That's absolutely true.
Absolutely. If there's someone senior in the room, then everybody just defers and bows to them, and nobody would even dream of trying to train them on something.
Yeah.
And then, of course, if the boss is doing the training, then everyone will say, yeah, really good, I understand, and I don't think it would be a particularly real experience. Okay. Shall we move on, Don?
I mean, we could talk on this subject all day, but yeah, let's move on. I mean, I'm very much enjoying the conversation. Let's move on.
Okay. There you go.
Oh, yeah, I love these questions, Neil, because they're very general, but we know that underneath it there's a strong current of experience. So talk us through this one.
Well, I mean, in a sense, I'm throwing these in because I'm challenging myself, because, I find if I'm tasked, I've got to...
To be fair to Kathleen Ivan, Kathleen is saying, what does this mean? So we need to be quite explicit.
Okay. Yes, very good. What this means is, does it really matter where you're training in the world? We live in a global village. At the end of the day, people are just people. They've got a job to do. Just get out there and train them, surely. Am I being a bit culturally oversensitive? Am I worrying too much about how training in different countries?
Can't you just get on with it, you're saying? For goodness sake.
Well, there you go. Chris has come back with, even people from the same cultures are different. Exactly.
But Chris, too, says, yes, I think so.
Oh, there you go. Oh, I love this.
Even people with the same name disagree. So I think I know what I'm going to get to on this one, which is that, Bonnie, I like Bonnie's point. Everyone learns differently. Culture is just an extra dimension, and it's an interesting point, Bonnie.
Absolutely. And I think it does come back to, I don't think you can worry too much. Maybe don't focus solely on the culture. I mean, like, when I went to Brazil, I was preparing slides with Portuguese keywords. They really appreciated that. But more appreciated the fact that I went slowly and pronounced everything clearly, because some of them were struggling with English, and that was appreciated more than me throwing out the odd Portuguese word. I think they appreciated the effort. And again, I think the real issues were about accepting a change in role, accepting the change that was coming, that this training was part of. That was much more significant than language or culture. But it was a cultural issue. But if you see, it wasn't about national culture, it was about organizational culture.
Dawn has said that she trains high-level lawyers all over the world, And when I pair them with their PAs, it works very well. 9 times out of 10, we have a very productive session. Okay, Dawn, I'll challenge you on that. And I'll say, is it possible that they come from a fairly homogenous culture themselves because they are high-level lawyers, and therefore they are all of the same sort of mind in a variety of ways? I'm not saying I'm right, it's just a question. And while I'm talking about that, while we're thinking about that one, Neil, a question for you. Paul Maltby just points out, hang on a second, let's not forget logistics, time for prayers, lunchtime, etc. is different in different places. If you're trying to teach a class during Ramadan and you're getting towards the end of the day, it can be jolly hard for everybody. And that surely is a difference, isn't it? Culture does have an impact there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, I think if you know that about your learners, I think what we're pointing to is you need to know as much about your learners as possible, whether you're training in the UK or whether you're training abroad. And just as you would phone up, find out from the person who's commissioning the training, how do people feel about it? I would hope we all would if we could. Similarly, when we're going into another culture, we do want to know about things, as you say, prayer times, fasting, cultural conditions that are going to impact on the learning. I think it makes absolute sense.
Now, I know not everybody's a football fan, but Lee and Chris too have talked about, Lee's talked about culture and language barriers, and Chris has talked about the Premier League in in England, where we have a lot of non-English managers still being able to get great performance out of their players. On the other hand, though, Chris, if you've got a lot of players who don't speak the same language, as Sunderland have discovered this season, it can be catastrophic. So it may be that if you share the same culture, that's one thing, but language barriers can be problematic, even when you're sharing the same culture, because you simply can't communicate properly. I don't know if that really helps us or not on this one. Let's go out of the football analogy.
No, I think it is good. I think we are, the world is so different now, so there is a lot more communication between cultures. However, we're in a learning environment. We, the trainer, need to know our learners, and being as sensitive as possible and as knowledgeable as possible about their culture would really help, obviously.
Just like to take my hat off to Leila in Morocco, who said last week we had Moroccans working with Japanese without knowing each other. It was a success in terms of work sessions, presentations, and relations. Leila, if you could share with us some of how you achieved that, would be great to know more about it. Because I think that how you made that work would be great to hear any your success tips from that. And Peter has raised an interesting point also about whether psychometric models and testing models such as MBTI work across different cultures.
Interesting. I mean, I also think we need to be aware of, as trainers, you go to a different culture, and there you are, you turn up to your classroom and you're there on time and nobody turns up. And then 20 minutes later, one person comes up and then they all dribs and drabs, and an hour later, everybody's in the classroom. Their appreciation of time might not be quite as tight as yours. You could get het up. You could get yourself in a real tiz about that. Similarly, somebody might just get up, walk out of your training room. Do you feel offended? Or is it not working? What have I done? Or is it just the way people, the way people are?
Know your people is the answer. Leila's come back with an interesting perspective. They sent us their bios, presentations on Morocco about Japanese, and presentations of Japan by Moroccans. So it sounds a little bit like the peer-to-peer stuff you were talking about, if I've got that right, Leila. Fascinating. I also like Evgenia's observation. People are more complex and clever than we suppose. Take away their own barriers, and language is no barrier. And I think that sort of summarizes what Leila's just said. Really well put point.
And she's got a point there about even just the difference between, say, US and UK, Ireland, where you're speaking the same language. So, well, of course we understand, but boy, do you sometimes realize when you might be speaking English, but you're actually talking a completely different language.
And it's not just the language. I was talking to some people the other day about their software. I was saying, look, you've got that report in the US, and it says bench strength. That doesn't mean the same thing, or it doesn't really work in English, in British English. But it's the cultural things as well, where unfortunately, because you speak a common language, you assume everything else about the culture is the same, and it isn't. If you've ever worked for a US company, you know that's not the case, and vice versa. It goes both ways, of course. Lots of interesting stuff coming through here, Neil.
again, that stuff about time, Melody there, one of the subject matter experts, about when people would arrive, their relationship with time compared to yours. And as you know, as pointed out, you're thinking, oh, I've got to hurry now. I can see the clock ticking, so you might cut across the bows, whereas people might turn up late and they might. I mean, it's like this. I've done business in the Middle East. You sit down and you talk about nothing for hours, and I'm thinking, well, when are we going to actually cut to the chase? Um, you have to be patient. You have to wait. And again, that's not necessarily a sign of disrespect. It's just the way things work.
Of course, they're not talking about nothing.
No, we're sizing each other up, but
Well, I think it's an important point that the role of the conversation has a huge part to play, doesn't it? And it's there for
definitely,
a reason.
absolutely. And it's full of all that body language and the listening that we were talking about earlier. I've moved on the slide because, again, this is something that has come up with people, and it's been mentioned about how we avoid the fear of loss of face in the classroom. What we want to avoid is the fear of loss of face, which is basically what shuts people up, means they don't participate. So I just wondered if, particularly for those who've trained in cultures where it is, where loss of face is a big thing, what we can do, any tips, any techniques that we can bring into a training session that we can make people feel at ease where they will be able to contribute without worrying about that loss of face.
And we had some interesting ones early on, didn't we? The idea of the post-it notes. But
Yep.
also I noticed some people, and people dropping things off in a box as you went out of the room and so on. Ways of avoiding that. I like Kirsten's point. Be positive. Reward good comments.
Yes. Yes. That's true. But I was doing an online course for this same business, and there were two from the Far East and two from Europe, and I thought I was going to be struggling to get the guys from the Far East to contribute, and actually they won hands down. They were really actively engaged, involved, asking questions. There wasn't any fear of loss of, and I was struggling to keep the Europeans engaged, so it was quite interesting.
Fantastic.
Again, culturally for me, it was a pleasant surprise.
There's some good references put in here. I've just dropped in one, a very substantial book. Peter has put in a reference to facilitating multicultural groups. I'm just going to say thank you for that. Any other references that people have, please drop them in. And any URLs, it'd be great to have those as well.
That's a good point there from Jonathan as well about generational differences. You know, you talk to somebody who's younger who might, yeah, exactly, they might be as scared of a different culture, but you know, it's a social barrier to learning.
Absolutely. Yes. I don't know if you've got the experience to say it, Neil, but do you notice any difference between generations internationally in the people you're working with?
Yes, I do actually. I mean, I'm again taking Brazil as a point where, you know, I've noticed that the young people are very focused, very willing to talk and offer an opinion, whereas the older generation are you have to struggle a bit more to get some interaction out of them. They're a bit more reserved, sitting back.
Some really interesting points coming through right now. Layla's saying the physical arrangement of the room is very important. Totally agree. The way you set the room up can make a massive difference, and the lighting is really important, Layla. You're quite right. Sarah says gender is important too. I mean, that's a huge thing. Any thoughts on that, Neil?
Yes, again, I've been in situations where I'm the trainer and I'm the only man in the room. I had a great time, I have to tell you, but sometimes, yes, the women took over and started telling stories among themselves. But again, just give it time. But obviously, you're going to have to, you are aware of that. That you know, if and similarly vice versa, or if there's somebody in the room, you know, there's only one man or one woman in the room amongst the group, how are they going to feel? And how it's going to affect the dynamic. I think it's going to be a big change to the dynamic.
And very often men are a dominant force in different cultures, and that will restrict the conversation of women. Sorry, it's great stuff coming through here. Rob talks about stealth input, chat, Yammer, Twitter, and so on. If people don't want to speak up verbally, a sort of technological equivalent to the post-it note. And delivering training with the Nordics, Paul says, We've got them working in their country groups to help them prepare for an activity in the local language. We've had other networking activities later where we mix them up. And I like this idea of getting people to work together in groups to feel comfortable and then mixing them up so you can have the networking and other things taking place. And Layla's point about breaks. We had somebody earlier, I can't remember who, I think it was Stephen, saying he was approached a lot in Singapore by students outside the lesson during breaks with questions. Neil, what's your thought about the break as an alternative to the classroom to avoid loss of face?
I think it's a really good idea because you're removing it. I think you're giving them the opportunity, and I think you need to take it away from the training room probably as well, so they do feel like they can just come up and have a little chat and not worry about it. So I think that's a very good idea. I do like the idea of using possible other alternative lines like a tweet or whatever it might be, some kind of messaging that will help people to interact and pose their questions.
Sarah asks a point about role play. Can be very useful, provided you're clear how it will be managed. Any thoughts on role play, Neil?
People hate it.
Well, come on, not everybody hates it. Sarah says it's been successful with it.
They always say they hate it, and the ones who are most passionate about hating it usually really get into it when you get them to do it, and suddenly they're, again, they're missing their vocation. So it's a tricky one. I find it, with so-called, interactive adults who speak English as a first language and don't have any hierarchical issues, it's a challenge to get them engaged. I would be very reticent about sort of bringing role play to
we have a total division here, right down the middle. Some people saying they hate it, other people are saying they love it. Kathleen says she tried it recently with teams in Bangalore, Beijing, US, Poland, which makes me think you wouldn't have continued, Kathleen, if it hadn't been successful. And Sarah's point is it's often badly managed. And Joe says, look, don't call it role play. Say we're going to do some group or co-coaching. Find a different way of putting it. Chris says, call it skills practice. And Paul says, difficult in Finland. I'd like to know why Finland is an issue. We're going to come back to the point of cheating later on, Telly One. I think it's a really important point. But while we're on role play, let's just have a look at this. So, Finland's very reserved. What do we do with this? And Caitlin says, Poland didn't work. The Bangalore team loved it. So it sounds to me like it's going to work in some places, but it may be difficult in other places.
It could be, and I think this is where you have to be really careful. Don't just do it, take the same old role play with you, and roll it out wherever you think you want a bit of it. You really need to think about it, particularly where they might be more reticent, and just build in ways, one where they can't help but have fun, and I think if the role play is absolutely seen as relevant, I think where people really don't like role play is they're thinking, why are we doing this?
Well, that's what Deb says. It doesn't feel real to me. I hate it, or it's just I don't like it. And Paul says the same thing. Real play works better. Bring in a real issue to work on. So perhaps that's what you're saying.
I think that's it. I mean, where it works best is I'm doing sort of scenario-based role play where it really is real. You will get this scenario. Now I'm going to time you, put the clock on, and let's deal with it and see what happens. And I think when they recognise that, then people are more prepared to enter into the spirit of it. But if it's at all abstract, I think people just think, oh, this is the touchy-feely part of the session. I don't like this.
Interesting point earlier on from KPN Reith saying, I get groups do the role play in their own language, which takes the pressure off. It's very easy to underestimate the amount of pressure you'll feel trying to do a role play in a foreign language, and then give them feedback on the tone of their voice, the body language, which I think is an interesting point. Let's not forget that trying to do a role play is bad enough for some people. Doing it in a foreign language, a lot of people will throw their hands up.
And we're talking about fear of loss of face here. You really are setting yourself a challenge.
Yeah. Okay.
Good. Thank you, everybody, for all those wonderful contributions. Let's going to move on now. Another of my meaningless questions. Why have I written that? Global organizations should use cutting-edge learning techniques. So it's a bit like, it doesn't really matter no matter where they were. If it works, if it's proven in UK or US or Europe that this works, that this is cutting edge, there's been research on it, whatever techniques it might be, the active learning, the online learning or whatever, just apply it. You're a global organization.
Get on with it.
Exactly. Everybody, should respond. We are a global organization, and that's that. Can you apply global norms? Well, really, I'll come on to the slide that really opens up the question. How appropriate and effective is our own model of learning in other cultures? So if you're a global organisation, you've got offices all over the world, you've got to teach people something, well, you just get out there and teach them in exactly the same way.
Yeah, and back to, I should say, this is the question which Neil is really asking. How appropriate and effective is our own model in other cultures? And Hazel's point is, look, try it. If it doesn't work, try something else. That sounds very pragmatic, Neil.
I like that idea, exactly, and in some cases particularly when, and this has again been my unfortunate experience, you're suddenly sent somewhere across the
You've
world at
had a
very
litany of
short notice.
disasters, haven't you?
Well, it's all been fun and it's actually all worked very well, but it's
Right.
literally sometimes you just don't have the choice.
Yes.
So you're sort of on a plane writing up notes, thinking about stuff that you could do, and you just got to see what happens when you get there. And it really is sort of trying as you go along, and dropping things that don't work and bringing in new things and winging it a bit, Don.
Okay, Jonathan Winter has asked, has anybody written a guide that covers these practical issues for a trainer with lots of different cultures? No, is the answer, because I've looked for it, Jonathan. However, I am working with the Institute, the Learning and Performance Institute, to produce something which will not be a fully fledged international guide, but it will be some questions which, if you answer them, will help with rollouts of international training. And the idea is to publish that next June. So we're working on just collecting as much material as possible. I'll drop my email at the end if you want to stay in touch about that one. It would be good. And Layla says, look, if you're an international institution, you should be thinking globally. What's your thought on that, Neil?
Yes, of course you should be thinking globally, but that doesn't mean that how learning is delivered, how it's received, and where you're going to actually impact on behaviours and performance is going to work in the same cultures. I really don't believe that, and that does come from experience. It's not going to be a massive change, but you need to take certain things into consideration, give more time for certain elements. Again, like we said, the sitting around and talking about supposedly nothing. If you don't build that in some areas, and yet if you brought that to Finland, for instance, maybe they go, what is this guy doing? Come on, get on with it. Why aren't we just getting on with the subject matter? So I think we need to just be aware that there will be differences. There isn't a global
Interesting
patch.
points from Jane and from Jane Butler and Ian Gardner. Jane says we use similar models in Europe, US, India, Far East. It works well in all with tweaks. And that sort of goes with the earlier point we had about flexibility. It also goes with Ian Gardner's point, and I like this. If a global organisation is aiming for shared values, and usually they are, then shared learning models would be part of that. In other words, we're doing it our way. I quite like that idea, and I think that may come back to the point we had earlier about the high-flying lawyers all being comfortable with the same approach, because presumably they share the same values and attitudes. So, Neil, question for you. How much should training and learning be a vehicle for conveying the shared attitudes and values of the organisation?
I think it should and it can, and I think one of our jobs as trainers is obviously it's just like a sales job, isn't it? But it depends who you're talking about. You're talking about international lawyers who are talking to international clients. That's fine. What about people who are just servicing, operational staff who are local, who are not going to be talking to anyone global? They might have the odd, email or communication, but it's you're drawing them out of their comfort zone, and is it really appropriate? So it's a question of what level you're training on.
Okay, fair enough. Deb Harriet raises a good point, Neil. Why the fuss about cutting-edge learning? We should just use the best technique to get the message across. Surely that's true, isn't it?
Absolutely, but I just thought as learning professionals, we obviously want to be on the cutting edge of everything we do.
Don't we just want to be effective and do a good job?
Of course you do. I'm really sort of just expressing my own aspiration to keep learning.
and a noble aspiration it is too. Joe Corey points out there is information on how to communicate and do business across cultures. That's true. And I think perhaps what we may do is after this set up a group on the LSG where we can get together and share those thoughts in case we're interested, because the Learning and Skills group. So towards the end of this session, I'll put that in. Now, we had a question earlier, which Kelly 1 raised, which I said I'd come back to. I'll come back to it now. Neil, cheating.
Yep.
In some cultures, there is so much pressure. There is so much a demand that individuals succeed and don't lose face, that people would cheat, rather than ask a question. Have you seen it? What can you do about it?
Well, obviously, where it is a culture of where loss of face is going to be the issue, you have to be very careful. You have to stand very delicately. And I have experienced that. And you just have to go back and repeat the message. If you know that's how they've done it, you don't want to point it out to them. I don't think that would work. I think you just end up alienating someone. So I think you just got to recognize when it's happening, mitigate the effects of it as much as you can by recapping on that point to make sure learning actually has gone in, and then rethink how you're going to be assessing people. If somebody's feeling that driven to cheat, how else can you do it where they're not going to feel so driven? I don't know. What do other people think?
Well, interestingly,
Anyone else had experiences?
Jessica says, don't forget, people may not view it as cheating, but just as a legitimate way of getting to the end point, which is getting the mark on the test. They may just regard it as helping. And David Morley says, we also have copying what was said as a kind of respect. In other words, you could be seen as not cheating at all, but contributing almost to the flow. So Sarah actually puts this across very well. I think we should recognise we have no built-in credibility across cultures and have to make sure people are confident in our knowledge base before they'll trust us enough and relax into different training methods. In other words, establish credibility at the beginning by knowing what you're talking about rather than relying on the artificial credibility, if you like, of your position. I think that's a really good point, Sarah. And that will help people trust us enough to say, well, okay, I'll come to you and I'll change my behaviour because I trust you and you know what you're talking about. What do you think about that, Neil? Do we need to persuade people more by being a good exemplar in our field?
I think so, but I think more importantly, it's the question that everybody asks. They're in a training room. Why am I here? And I think if we can really, focus on that and light that spark in them so they do know why they're there, they do know why it's really important that they're doing this, and it's put in the bigger picture rather than, okay, here's the guy, he knows about this or he knows about that. So I think this is where we need to be as trainers to know about that bigger picture so we can bring that into the classroom and constantly refer to it. Because if you're doing that, then people will I think they'll run along with it much more. You've got to get the hearts and minds early on.
And Sarah's point, which she got to via a response to an answer from Jonathan, was that it may be okay to begin with a didactic chalk and talk approach if that's what people need to see. So stand up and do it their way. Hey guys, I can do it your way. I can do it well. I know what I'm talking about. Feel comfortable. This is what you've always had through probably the first 15 years of your life as a child at school and at university. Right, now I've got you on board, we're going to move things a bit. Maybe that's something that works. Jessica's raising another point about culture here, saying your own ideas often aren't expected until the end point of the learning process. And she's talking, or Melody picks this up and talks about individualistic culture versus more community-based culture. And again, I'd recommend the book, if you wanted to think more about that, by Gert Hofstede, called Cultures and Organizations. Here it is landing on my desk. It's over 600 to read that book if you're going to buy it, but it is worth reading. Neil, we're getting close to the end now. Do you want to take us through and wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, really, I think that's it. I don't think my memory serves you right. I think that is the last slide. For me, it's just been really useful seeing what everybody's put there. I think it shows that there are a lot more questions around this than other necessary answers. There's some amazing observations from people and their experiences. But what I also like is the surprise where, as people have said, I chucked two different people together and, hey, it worked. I think we've got to remain optimistic. As you say, establish your credibility early on, remain optimistic, listen to the people in there by listening to what they say and looking at how they are, and then, you just got to have the confidence to go forward, and sometimes it really is, I think, just taking the plunge.
One last question. A lot of stuff, coming back to this point that was raised earlier about Jonathan and Sarah having this conversation about starting with a particular approach. KP entry says, I personally avoid a didactic approach. It sets a tone for the whole day. I prefer building credibility by enabling delegates